Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting back to the 15th century, a time of plague, political chaos, and some truly catastrophic romantic decisions made by people who really should have known better. But they didn't, because they were royals, and knowing better wasn't exactly part of the job description. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, let your shoulders drop. We're going to spend the next hour and a half wandering through the love lives of medieval nobility. And I promise you, none of these stories end well. Not in the way you'd hope, anyway. Tonight's theme is romance, but not the kind you'd find in a Jane Austen novel. No, this is 15th century royal romance, which means it's mostly about political alliances, severe genetic consequences, and an alarming number of people marrying their cousins. Sometimes they're very close cousins. Sometimes, well, we'll get to that. The thing about royal love in this era is that it wasn't really about love at all. It was about land and titles and making sure your family's bloodline stayed pure, which is a nice way of saying they kept marrying the same 6 families over and over until everyone started looking vaguely related. Because they were. But every so often, someone would fall in actual love, and that's when things got really messy. Let's start with Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, which should tell you everything you need to know, but we'll dive in anyway. Charles became king in 1380 at the age of 11, which was not ideal, but it was fine because he had uncles to run things, several uncles, all of whom immediately started fighting over who got to control the child king and, more importantly, the royal treasury. Standard stuff. For the first few years, little Charles was mostly kept out of the way while grown men argued about money. He was married off at 14 to Isabeau of Bavaria, who was 13. Neither of them had much say in the matter. This was an arranged marriage in the truest sense. 2 teenagers who'd never met, shoved together for political reasons, expected to produce heirs and stay out of trouble. And for a while, it worked. Sort of. Charles and Isabeau actually seemed to get along, which was a minor miracle in royal marriages. They had 12 children together, which suggests that they spent at least some time in each other's company. Isabeau was reportedly intelligent, politically savvy, and extremely good at navigating the absolute circus that was the French court. But then Charles started losing his mind, literally. It began in 1392, when Charles was 23. He was leading an expedition to Brittany, riding through a forest on a hot August day, when a man in rags suddenly appeared and grabbed the king's horse, shouting warnings about betrayal. The guards shoved the man away, and the expedition continued. But Charles was rattled. A few hours later, as they were crossing an open plain, one of the pages accidentally dropped a lance. It hit a metal helmet with a loud clang, and Charles snapped. He drew his sword, started screaming about traitors, and attacked his own knights. He killed 4 men before he was wrestled off his horse and restrained. Then he collapsed, unconscious, and stayed that way for days. When he woke, he had no memory of what happened. He seemed fine. Mostly fine, a little shaken, but functional. And then it happened again, and again, and again. Charles's episodes became more frequent and more bizarre. Sometimes he would forget who he was. Sometimes he would forget he was king. Sometimes he would forget he was married, or that he had children, or that he was human. During one particularly bad episode, he became convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to keep himself from breaking. He refused to bathe for months at a time because water might crack him. He wouldn't let anyone near him. Servants had to chase him around the palace when he ran away shrieking about glass assassins. Isabel, understandably, found this challenging. She tried to help him. She brought in doctors, priests, sorcerers, anyone who might be able to cure the king's madness. Nothing worked. Charles would recover for a few months, seem normal, and then spiral again into paranoia and delusion. During his lucid periods, he and Isabel continued to have children, which is remarkable, really, considering the circumstances. But 12 children in total suggests that there were at least some extended stretches of relative stability. The problem was that Charles's madness left a power vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. So do French nobles. Isabel found herself in an impossible position. She was the queen of a country whose king couldn't reliably remember his own name. She had to manage court politics, raise a dozen children, and somehow keep France from imploding, while two rival factions, led by Charles's relatives, fought for control. It didn't go well. Historians have been unkind to Isabel. She's often painted as ambitious, manipulative, even treasonous. Some accounts claim she had affairs. Some say she schemed to disinherit her own son. Most of this is probably exaggerated or outright false, the product of political propaganda from people who hated her. What's more likely is that she was exhausted. She was trying to hold together a kingdom and a marriage while her husband thought he was glass. At some point, she seems to have just given up on the marriage part. Not officially, of course, you couldn't divorce a king, but emotionally, practically, she distanced herself. She focused on politics, on survival, on keeping her children alive in a country that was falling apart. Charles, meanwhile, continued his slow descent into permanent madness. By the end of his life, he was barely functional. He lived in squalor, refused to change his clothes, and didn't recognize his own family. He died in 1422, at the age of 53. Isabel outlived him by 13 years. She spent most of that time in political exile, blamed by both sides of the Civil War for France's troubles. So that's one love story, a queen married to a man who thought he was glass. Romantic in a deeply sad way.
Let's drift over to England now, because the English were having their own romantic disasters, and frankly, they were just as messy. Edward IV of England was tall, handsome, and charismatic. By medieval standards, he was basically a movie star. Women reportedly found him extremely attractive, and he knew it. He used it. He had mistresses scattered across the kingdom, and he wasn't particularly subtle about it. Edward became king in 1461, at the age of 18, after overthrowing the previous king in a civil war, the Wars of the Roses. You've heard of them. Lots of fighting, lots of family betrayal, very little actual rose-based combat. As the new king, Edward was expected to make a strategic marriage, an alliance with France maybe, or Burgundy, someone important, someone who would bring land or money or soldiers. His advisors had it all planned out. They were in negotiations with the French. Everything was proceeding smoothly. And then Edward went and fell in love. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. She was a widow with 2 children, which was already a problem. She was also English, which meant she brought no foreign alliances, and she was a commoner. Well, minor nobility, technically, but not royal, not even close. Edward met her in 1464, supposedly while she was petitioning him for help. Her late husband's lands had been confiscated, and she needed the king's intervention. Edward, being Edward, immediately tried to seduce her. Elizabeth said no. This was unusual. Most women did not say no to the king. But Elizabeth was clever. She knew that if she slept with him, she'd become just another mistress, forgotten in a few months, tossed aside when he got bored. So she held out. And Edward, unused to rejection, became obsessed. He courted her, he pursued her, he offered her money, titles, gifts. She refused everything. Finally, Edward did something absolutely wild. He married her, in secret, at dawn, in a small ceremony with almost no witnesses. When the news got out, the court lost its collective mind. Edward's advisors were furious. His mother was horrified. His chief supporter, the Earl of Warwick, felt personally betrayed. Warwick had been negotiating that French marriage. He'd promised the French king that Edward would marry a French princess, and now he looked like an idiot. But Edward didn't care. He was in love, or in lust, possibly both. He made Elizabeth his queen, crowned her in a lavish ceremony, and proceeded to give her entire family positions of power. Her father became a high-ranking noble. Her siblings married into the most powerful families in England. The Woodvilles went from minor gentry to major players almost overnight. Everyone hated them. The old noble families resented these upstarts. The Woodvilles were seen as greedy, opportunistic, and far too ambitious for their station, which was probably true. Elizabeth's family took full advantage of their new status, grabbing titles and land as fast as they could. And Warwick, the man who'd helped Edward win the throne in the first place, felt increasingly sidelined. He'd been the power behind the throne. Now he was competing with the Queen's relatives for influence. So Warwick did what any self-respecting medieval nobleman would do. He rebelled. He actually overthrew Edward briefly in 1470, forcing the king into exile. Edward eventually fought his way back, defeated Warwick, and reclaimed the throne. But the whole mess could have been avoided if Edward had just married a French princess like he was supposed to. Instead, he married for love, and it nearly cost him his kingdom. To be fair to Edward and Elizabeth, they do seem to have had a genuine partnership. She was politically intelligent, and he trusted her judgment. They had 10 children together. Edward continued to have affairs, because of course he did, but Elizabeth remained his queen and his closest advisor. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, at the age of 40, Elizabeth's world collapsed. Edward's brother, Richard, seized power. He declared Edward's marriage to Elizabeth invalid, which made all their children illegitimate. He took the throne for himself, becoming Richard III. Elizabeth's 2 young sons, the rightful heirs, were taken to the Tower of London and never seen again. The princes in the tower. You know the story. 2 boys disappeared, probably murdered. Their bones may be found centuries later during renovations. Elizabeth spent the rest of her life trying to navigate the political chaos. She eventually made peace with Richard's successor, Henry VII, and lived quietly until her death in 1492. So, that's the second love story. A king who married for passion instead of politics, and it ended with his children murdered and his wife powerless. Let's move on to someone even tragicer. Joanna of Castile was born in 1779, the 3rd child of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. You know, the Isabella who funded Christopher Columbus, the power couple who united Spain and launched the Inquisition, those people. Joanna wasn't supposed to be important. She had an older brother and an older sister. The brother would inherit Castile, the sister would make a strategic marriage. Joanna was the spare, the backup, the one they'd marry off to some minor alliance. Except her older brother died, and then her older sister died, and suddenly Joanna was the heir to Castile, which made her extremely valuable. When Joanna was 16, her parents arranged for her to marry Philip of Burgundy. Philip was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, which meant this marriage would link Spain to the Habsburg dynasty, a powerful alliance, exactly the kind of match you'd want for your heir. Joanna was shipped off to Flanders in 1996. She'd never met Philip, she spoke no Flemish, she knew almost nothing about her future husband, except that he was politically important. Philip, for his part, was reportedly very handsome. Tall, blonde, charming. He was called Philip the Handsome, which is the kind of nickname you get when you're attractive and not much else. Joanna fell for him immediately. And Philip, well, he tolerated her. He wasn't cruel, exactly, but he didn't love her. He had mistresses, lots of mistresses. He spent most of his time hunting, drinking, and sleeping with other women. Joanna was the wife, the one who produced heirs, not the one he actually wanted to spend time with. This devastated Joanna.
She became intensely jealous. She fought with Philip constantly about his affairs. She had screaming matches with his mistresses. Once, she allegedly cut off the hair of one of Philip's lovers in a fit of rage. Philip found this annoying. He started avoiding her, which made her more desperate, which made him avoid her more. A vicious cycle. They had 6 children together, which suggests they reconciled at least occasionally. But the marriage was deeply unhappy. And then things got worse. In 1504, Joanna's mother, Isabella, died. Joanna inherited the throne of Castile. She was now Queen of Castile, one of the most powerful positions in Europe. Philip immediately saw an opportunity. If Joanna was queen and he was her husband, then he could rule Castile through her. He pressured her to hand over power to him. Joanna refused. So Philip did what any loving husband would do. He declared her insane. He claimed she was mentally unstable, unfit to rule, dangerously jealous and irrational. He convinced the Castilian nobles that Joanna needed to be sidelined for her own good. He took control of the kingdom. And Joanna, heartbroken and furious, had no way to fight back. But then, in 1506,
Philip suddenly died. Food poisoning, maybe, or typhoid. No one's quite sure. He was 28 years old. Joanna was shattered. According to legend, and this part might be exaggerated, Joanna refused to let Philip be buried. She traveled across Castile with his corpse, stopping at convents and churches, keeping the coffin with her at all times. She supposedly opened the coffin repeatedly to look at his body, to kiss him, to check if he'd come back to life. This probably didn't happen exactly like that, but it makes a good story, and it cemented Joanna's reputation as Joanna the Mad. Her father, Ferdinand, used this reputation to seize control of Castile. He had Joanna declared unfit to rule and locked her in a castle in Tordesillas. She spent the next 46 years there, imprisoned by her own family. She wasn't insane, not really. She was depressed, grief-stricken, and probably suffering from some form of mental illness. But mostly she was inconvenient, a queen who wouldn't hand over power quietly. So they called her mad and locked her away. She died in 1555 at the age of 75, having spent most of her adult life in captivity. That's the third love story. A woman who loved her husband desperately, and he used her, betrayed her, and died, leaving her to be buried alive by her own family. Cheerful stuff. Margaret of Anjou was 15 years old when she married Henry VI of England in 1445. She'd been chosen carefully. Her father was a minor French noble, which meant the marriage could be presented as a peace offering between England and France. The two countries had been fighting the 100 Years' War for, well, 100 years at that point. Everyone was exhausted. Margaret was supposed to be decorative, pleasant, a symbol of peace who would smile at banquets and produce heirs and stay out of politics. That's not what happened. Henry VI was 23 when he married Margaret. He was pious, gentle, and completely unsuited to being king. He hated violence. He hated conflict. He spent most of his time praying and founding colleges. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely kind person. Which sounds lovely, except that being king of England in the 14th century required you to be decisive, ruthless, and occasionally willing to execute your enemies. Henry was none of those things. He let his advisors run the country, and his advisors were corrupt, incompetent, and constantly fighting with each other. England was bleeding money. The war with France was going badly. The nobles were restless. Margaret watched all of this and thought, quite reasonably, that someone needed to take charge. So she did. She was a teenager in a foreign country, but she was smart and she was ambitious. She started building alliances, advising Henry, pushing for certain policies. She became the real power behind the throne. The English nobles hated her for it. They called her overbearing, aggressive, unfeminine. She was French, which didn't help. The war with France was still fresh in everyone's minds, and here was this French woman telling English lords what to do. Margaret didn't care. She knew Henry couldn't hold the kingdom together on his own. Someone had to do it. And then, in 1556, Henry had a complete mental breakdown. It came out of nowhere. One day he was fine, well, fine for Henry, and the next day he was completely unresponsive. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't recognize anyone. He just sat there, staring at nothing, like his mind had simply left his body. Doctors had no idea what was wrong with him. Some called it a stupor. Others thought he was possessed. Modern historians think it might have been a severe depressive episode or catatonic schizophrenia. Whatever it was, Henry was gone. Mentally, he'd vanished. Margaret was 7 months pregnant at the time. She brought a son to Henry, hoping it might snap him out of his stupor. Henry didn't react. He didn't even look at his son. Margaret was now in an impossible position. Her husband was incapacitated, she had a newborn son, and the kingdom was on the verge of civil war.
The Duke of York, a powerful noble with his own claim to the throne, saw an opportunity. He declared himself protector of the realm, effectively seizing control of the government. Margaret tried to fight back, but she had no real power without Henry. And then, in 1454, Henry woke up. Just like that, after more than a year of being catatonic, he suddenly snapped back to awareness. He had no memory of the lost time. He didn't know he had a son. When they told him about baby Edward, He seemed confused, like he thought they were joking. But he was functional again. Sort of. The Duke of York was pushed out, and Henry resumed his role as king. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't last. Henry's fragile mental state made him a weak king, and weakness in a medieval monarch is blood in the water. The Duke of York started gathering support. Other nobles chose sides, and in 1455, the Wars of the Roses officially began. Margaret threw herself into the conflict. She raised armies, negotiated alliances, led military campaigns. She was ferocious, ruthless, everything Henry wasn't. She had to be. Her son's inheritance was at stake. If York won, Edward would lose his claim to the throne. He might even lose his life. The war dragged on for years. Battles were won and lost. Henry was captured, rescued, captured again. He spent most of the conflict as a helpless figurehead, shuffled around by whichever side currently held him. Margaret kept fighting. But in 1461, York's son, Edward, who would become Edward IV, the same Edward we talked about earlier, won a decisive victory. Henry and Margaret fled north. Margaret escaped to Scotland with her son. Henry was eventually captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Margaret spent the next few years trying to raise support for a counterattack. She went to France begging for help. She pawned her jewelry to pay soldiers. She was relentless. In 1470, she actually succeeded. With French support and help from the Earl of Warwick, yes, the same Warwick who turned against Edward, Margaret's forces managed to overthrow Edward and restore Henry to the throne. Henry had been locked in the Tower for years at this point. He was thin, confused, barely aware of what was happening, but he was king again. It lasted less than a year. Edward IV regrouped, invaded England, and defeated Margaret's army at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. Margaret's son, Edward, who was killed in the battle, he was 17 years old. Margaret was captured. Henry, back in the Tower, died a few weeks later. Officially, he died of melancholy. More likely, he was murdered. Margaret spent the next 4 years as a prisoner. Eventually, she was ransomed by the King of France and allowed to return home. She lived quietly in poverty until her death in 1482 at the age of 52. So, that's the fourth love story. A woman who married a kind, gentle man completely incapable of protecting her or their son. She fought for 20 years to save them both. She lost everything. Let's move to somewhere warmer, Italy, where the romance was just as doomed but with better architecture. Lucrezia Borgia is one of history's most misunderstood women. She's been painted as a poisoner, a seductress, a scheming villainess. Most of that is fiction, propaganda spread by her family's enemies. The reality is sadder and much more straightforward. Lucrezia was a pawn, used by her father and brother for political gain, married off repeatedly, discarded when convenient. She was born in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. Yes, the Pope had children, several of them. This was the Renaissance. Celibacy was more of a suggestion. Lucrezia was reportedly very beautiful, blonde, graceful, charming. Her father adored her. He also saw her as a useful diplomatic tool. Her first engagement was arranged when she was 11 to a Spanish nobleman. That engagement was broken off 2 years later when her father found a better offer, an Italian lord. That engagement was also canceled. Finally, in 1493, when Lucrezia was 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. This marriage was purely political. The Borgias wanted an alliance with the Sforza family. Lucrezia and Giovanni were married in a lavish ceremony at the Vatican. There was a banquet, dancing. The Pope himself officiated. And then Lucrezia was sent off to live with her new husband, a man in his 20s whom she barely knew. The marriage was unhappy from the start. Giovanni was suspicious, paranoid, and aware that he'd been chosen for political convenience, not personal merit. Lucrezia was a teenager trapped in a marriage she hadn't wanted. After 3 years, the Borgias decided the Sforza alliance was no longer useful. They wanted her back so they could marry her to someone else. They couldn't just divorce her. Well, they could, but it would be complicated. So they came up with a different plan. Pope Alexander VI declared the annulment on the grounds that it had never been consummated. Giovanni was furious. He knew this was a lie. He'd been married to Lucrezia for 3 years. Of course the marriage had been consummated. But you can't really argue with the Pope, especially when the Pope is her father. Giovanni signed the annulment papers, but he made sure to spread rumors that the real reason for the annulment was that Lucrezia was having an affair with her own brother, Cesare Giovanni Borgia. This rumor, completely unfounded, would follow Lucrezia for the rest of her life. After the annulment, Lucrezia was married again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. Lucrezia was 17. Alfonso was also in his teens. And this time, Lucrezia actually fell in love. Alfonso was gentle, kind, and genuinely seemed to care about her. They had a son together. For a brief moment, Lucrezia was happy. Then her brother Cesare decided Alfonso was inconvenient.
The political situation had changed. The Borgias no longer needed an alliance with Naples. In fact, Naples was now an obstacle to Cesare's ambitions. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, stabbed multiple times. He survived, barely, and was carried back to the Vatican to recover. Lucrezia nursed him herself. She was terrified that whoever had tried to kill him would try again. She was right. A few weeks later, while Alfonso was still recovering, Cesare's men entered his room and strangled him to death. Lucrezia was 19 years old. She'd been married twice, lost her first marriage to political maneuvering, and watched her second husband murdered by her own brother. She was devastated. Her father tried to comfort her. He arranged another marriage, because of course he did. In 1501, Lucrezia was married for a third time to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This was the most prestigious match yet. The Este family was old, powerful, and respected. Alfonso d'Este was not thrilled about marrying Lucrezia. He'd heard all the rumors, the poison, the incest, the scandal. But the Pope was offering a massive dowry and political advantages, so Alfonso agreed. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in 1502. She was 21 years old, twice widowed, and carrying an enormous amount of baggage, both literal and metaphorical. The Este family treated her with suspicion. The people of Ferrara whispered about her. But Lucrezia surprised everyone. She became a model duchess. She was gracious, charitable, cultured. She patronized artists and poets. She managed the court with intelligence and diplomacy. Alfonso, who'd married her reluctantly, gradually warmed to her. They weren't passionately in love, but they developed a partnership. She gave him multiple children. He gave her respect. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia had some measure of peace. She died in 1519 at the age of 39, shortly after giving birth to her 8th child. History remembers her as a Borgia, with all the dark implications that name carries. But really, she was just a woman used by the men in her life. Married off as a child, widowed violently, remarried for politics. That's the 5th love story. A woman who finally found stability, but only after losing everything else first. We're not even close to done. Catherine of Aragon was born in 1885, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who were Joanna the Mad's parents. This family really gets around. Catherine was raised to be a queen, educated, poised, trained in languages and diplomacy. When she was 3 years old, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII of England. This was a huge alliance. England and Spain united through marriage. Both kingdoms were thrilled. Catherine arrived in England in 1501 when she was 15. Arthur was also 15. They were married in a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. And then, 5 months later, Arthur died. Probably the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that killed quickly and terrified everyone. Arthur caught it, and within weeks, he was dead. Catherine was 15 years old, and suddenly a widow in a foreign country. Now, normally she would have been sent home to Spain. The alliance was broken, the marriage was over. But both England and Spain had invested heavily in this match. Catherine had brought an enormous dowry.
Neither side wanted to give up the money or the alliance. So they came up with a plan. Catherine would marry Arthur's younger brother. There was just one problem. Church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. It was considered incest. Unless the first marriage had never been consummated. Then, technically, Catherine wasn't really Arthur's widow. She was just a girl who'd been married to him briefly, and then he died. Catherine swore that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Arthur had been too sick. They'd shared a bed maybe a handful of times and nothing had happened. Whether this was true or not, we'll never know, but it was the story they went with. Pope Julius II granted a special dispensation allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow, and in 1509, shortly after Henry became king, Henry and Catherine were married. Catherine was 23, Henry was 17, and for a while they were genuinely happy. Henry was young, athletic, and charming. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and capable. They seemed well matched. Henry called her his true and loving wife. She advised him on politics. They attended Mass together. They had a real partnership. The only problem was that Catherine couldn't produce a male heir. She got pregnant multiple times, but most of the pregnancies ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. She had one daughter who survived, Mary, born in 1916, but no sons. This was a disaster. England needed a male heir. The country had just emerged from decades of civil war. A female ruler was seen as weak, dangerous, an invitation to chaos. Henry became increasingly desperate. By the late 28s, he'd fallen for Anne Boleyn, a young woman at court. Anne was clever, ambitious, and refused to become Henry's mistress. She wanted to be queen. Henry decided he needed to annul Catherine's marriage. He came up with a theological argument. The marriage had been cursed from the start because it violated God's law. Leviticus said a man shouldn't marry his brother's widow. The Pope's dispensation had been wrong. The marriage was invalid. Catherine was horrified. She insisted the marriage was valid. She'd been a virgin when she married Henry. Her first marriage had never been consummated. She'd done nothing wrong. Henry didn't care. He wanted out. He pressured the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope, caught between Henry and Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused. So, Henry broke with Rome entirely. He declared himself head of the Church of England and annulled the marriage himself. Catherine was stripped of her title. She was no longer queen, just Princess Dowager, Arthur's widow. Her servants were taken away. Her income was cut. She was isolated, humiliated, and heartbroken. She died in 1536 at the age of 39, shortly after giving birth to her 8th child. History remembers her as a Borgia, with all the dark implications that name carries. But really, she was just a woman used by the men in her life, married off as a child, widowed violently, remarried for politics. That's the 5th love story. A woman who finally found stability, but only after losing everything else first. We're not even close to done. Catherine of Aragon was born in 1885, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who were Joanna the Mad's parents. This family really gets around. Catherine was raised to be a queen, educated, poised, trained in languages and diplomacy. When she was 3 years old, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII of England. This was a huge alliance. England and Spain united through marriage. Both kingdoms were thrilled. Catherine arrived in England in 1501 when she was 15. Arthur was also 15. They were married in a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. And then, 5 months later, Arthur died. Probably the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that killed quickly and terrified everyone. Arthur caught it, and within weeks, he was dead. Catherine was 15 years old, and suddenly a widow in a foreign country. Now, normally she would have been sent home to Spain. The alliance was broken, the marriage was over. But both England and Spain had invested heavily in this match. Catherine had brought an enormous dowry. Neither side wanted to give up the money or the alliance. So they came up with a plan. Catherine would marry Arthur's younger brother. There was just one problem. Church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. It was considered incest. Unless the first marriage had never been consummated. Then, technically, Catherine wasn't really Arthur's widow. She was just
a girl who'd been married to him briefly, and then he died. Catherine swore that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Arthur had been too sick. They'd shared a bed maybe a handful of times and nothing had happened. Whether this was true or not, we'll never know, but it was the story they went with. Pope Julius II granted a special dispensation allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow, and in 1509, shortly after Henry became king, Henry and Catherine were married. Catherine was 23, Henry was 17, and for a while they were genuinely happy. Henry was young, athletic, and charming. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and capable. They seemed well matched. Henry called her his true and loving wife. She advised him on politics. They attended Mass together. They had a real partnership. The only problem was that Catherine couldn't produce a male heir. She got pregnant multiple times, but most of the pregnancies ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. She had one daughter who survived, Mary, born in 1916, but no sons. This was a disaster. England needed a male heir. The country had just emerged from decades of civil war. A female ruler was seen as weak, dangerous, an invitation to chaos. Henry became increasingly desperate. By the late 28s, he'd fallen for Anne Boleyn, a young woman at court. Anne was clever, ambitious, and refused to become Henry's mistress. She wanted to be queen. Henry decided he needed to annul Catherine's marriage. He came up with a theological argument. The marriage had been cursed from the start because it violated God's law. Leviticus said a man shouldn't marry his brother's widow. The Pope's dispensation had been wrong. The marriage was invalid. Catherine was horrified. She insisted the marriage was valid. She'd been a virgin when she married Henry. Her first marriage had never been consummated. She'd done nothing wrong. Henry didn't care. He wanted out. He pressured the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope, caught between Henry and Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor,